How did people live in cities that officially didn't exist? In the USSR, there were entire cities with homes, schools, hospitals, and movie theaters, but with no name on the map, no right to say where you lived, and almost no way to leave. What were these closed atomic cities really like? How did people live there? And what did it mean to be born in a place that was itself a state secret? There were cities in Soviet history that functioned like completely real places. Homes, schools, stores, movie theaters. But officially, it was as if they didn't exist. They weren't shown on public maps. Their names were hidden behind code numbers, and letters weren't sent to the city. They were sent to a post office box, or under the name of the nearest regional center. Arzamas 16, Chelyabinsk 65, Krasnoyarsk 26. Numbers instead of names. That's how the Soviet closed cities came into being. They really started appearing on a large scale after 1945, when the USSR was rushing to build its atomic program as fast as possible. The goal wasn't just to build a bomb. It was to build an entire system: uranium mining, plutonium production, research centers, design bureaus, and assembly plants. At first, workers' settlements grew up around these sites. Then they turned into full-fledged cities. They were built far from major population centers, in places with water, railroads, and the ability to maintain strict secrecy. The Urals and Siberia were almost perfect for that. The best people were sent there: physicists, engineers, technologists. The selection process was tough. They looked not just at education and experience, but at a person's family background too. At the same time, military construction crews, civilian workers, and especially in the early years, Gulag prisoners were used on the construction sites. The Gulag was the Soviet system of forced labor camps. Millions of people passed through it. Their labor was heavily used on some of the biggest construction projects in the country, including secret ones. So behind the facade of a city of science and progress stood a harsh mobilization machine. But a closed city wasn't just a factory behind a fence. Wives, husbands, and children came along with the specialists. Schools appeared, hospitals, houses of culture, libraries, stadiums. The people living in these cities weren't just the ones building the bomb. There were also teachers, doctors, store clerks, librarians. These weren't shift-work settlements. They were real cities, just shaped entirely around the logic of a secret facility. How people hid where they lived, even from relatives. The secrecy system was built in such a way that a person literally couldn't tell the truth about where they lived, not even to close family. And it worked through several overlapping mechanisms at once. The city was removed from maps, from public documents of any kind. In official statistics, residents could be listed as living in a nearby major city. The city's actual name was replaced with a code name, the nearest known city plus a number. Not a real name, but Chelyabinsk 65 or Krasnoyarsk 26. Mail went through a cover story. Letters were addressed to a coded address or routed through the nearest large city, so even the envelope wouldn't reveal where someone actually lived. Residents were required to stick to the official version. If someone lived in Chelyabinsk 70, they said they lived in Chelyabinsk, period. Leaving the city was tightly controlled. In the early years, people in some closed cities were barely allowed out at all. Some specialists even had their passports taken away. And when travel was allowed, the person was given a separate cover story they had to stick to once outside. Employees signed non-disclosure agreements. Inside the facilities themselves, there were security clearances, code words, and rigid control over information. At the same time, different people had very different pictures of what was actually going on. Scientists and senior engineers understood what they were working on. Rank-and-file employees often knew only their own section. What the next workshop was doing wasn't their business. And residents not directly tied to the facility, teachers, doctors, store clerks, could live there for years without really understanding what was being made behind the fence. Secrecy didn't just work outward, it also worked inward. Information was divided by clearance levels, and everyone knew exactly as much as they were supposed to know, no more. What life was like inside, men and women worked hard. In the early years, often to the point of exhaustion, long, irregular hours, unpredictable days off, night shifts. And women weren't just wives attached to the facility. Many of them worked directly in production. Materials on the Mayak complex, for example, openly note that in a number of departments, most of the workforce was female. These weren't barracks. These were real cities. People got married, had children, received apartments, and sent their kids to school. By the early 1950s, many of these cities already had movie theaters, stadiums, and theaters. According to a number of studies, housing construction in the closed cities moved much faster than the national average. One of the biggest unspoken advantages of living in a closed city was supply. While ordinary Soviet cities regularly had empty shelves and long lines for basic food, closed cities had very little shortage. In residents' memoirs and in research, the same point keeps coming up again and again. The food was there. There was choice, and in the late Soviet years, when conditions outside got much worse, the contrast became especially obvious. Wages were higher too, usually about 15 to 20% higher, and for some specialists, even more than that. But that came at the price of freedom. Until 1954, residents of many closed cities effectively couldn't leave the territory at all, not even for vacation. Later the regime was eased, but travel still required passes, approvals, and signed paperwork. The fear of saying too much was always there in the background. Correspondence was monitored. Documents didn't show a real address. They showed a code name. And for workers in hazardous industries, there was another kind of fear on top of that: radiation. In the early years, many people didn't fully understand the scale of the risk, and radiation sickness among employees really was a serious problem. And still, the prestige was real. Getting into one of these cities meant higher status, better supply, stronger medical care, often decent housing, and the feeling of being part of something enormous. Architecture historians have even described the first atomic cities as a kind of communism behind barbed wire. For the specialists the state needed, conditions were created that were out of reach for most Soviet citizens. How children saw this life, and how adults felt about it. Children in a closed city often didn't experience it as a regime. To them, it just felt like the natural order of things. Their own closed, easy-to-understand world. School, the courtyard, after-school clubs, the stadium. Familiar faces everywhere. In memoirs by former residents, the same feeling comes up over and over again. The city felt like a protected space, where outsiders didn't get in, and the outside world felt distant, less ordered, and almost foreign. Adults saw that same reality in a more complicated way. They understood the price of that comfort much better: the pass system, the inability to talk about work, the obligation to live by secrecy rules. But they also felt the advantages more sharply: steady work, good supply, strong schools, order. For many people, their attitude toward the closed city was deeply mixed. Pride in being part of a major state mission and exhaustion from constant restrictions. Those two feelings existed side by side. Neither one cancelled out the other. Even during the Soviet period itself, these cities raised at least two generations, often three. First came the founders, then their children grew up, then their grandchildren. Industry materials specifically mention work dynasties, and that's no accident. A closed city pretty quickly stopped being just a settlement of newcomers. It became a place with its own family continuity, its own memory, its own pride, and its own boundaries. Boundaries people eventually stopped even noticing. What happened to these cities afterward? They didn't disappear after the Soviet Union collapsed. In 1992, Russia passed the law on closed administrative territorial entities, or ZATOs. It officially zakrepil their status, controlled zones, restrictions on entry and residence, and special living conditions. In the early 1990s, the list of these cities became more open. Many of them got back their real geographic names. Ozersk, for example, officially received its open name in 1994. Their later histories went in different directions. Some cities remained closed and still serve atomic, military, or space infrastructure to this day. Others were gradually opened up. In the 1990s, many of them went through a severe crisis. The old funding system collapsed, and the cities were tightly dependent on a single enterprise. According to Rosatom, the Zato law helped keep them from falling apart completely in those years. Today, Rosatom's atomic family includes 31 cities. If you had to put it very simply, a closed city in the USSR wasn't just a secret dot on the map. It was a real city built around a top-secret facility where people paid for a relatively good and stable life with isolation and constant control. Cities of the Soviet atomic project. Cities where nuclear weapons were designed. Sarov, Gorky 130, Kremlev, Arzamas 75, Arzamas 16. Sarov was the heart of the Soviet nuclear project. This is where KB-11 was created in 1946, the first secret Soviet design bureau for developing nuclear weapons. Later, it became VNIIEF, the All-Russian Scientific Research Institute of Experimental Physics. This is where the first Soviet atomic bombs and thermonuclear weapons were designed. This is where Kurchatov, Sakharov, and Khariton worked. It wasn't just a closed city. It was the main symbol of Soviet scientific secrecy, a place where physics, state power, and military necessity fused into one mechanism. Snezhinsk, Chelyabinsk 50, Chelyabinsk 70. Snezhinsk became the USSR's second nuclear center. Not the first breakthrough, but the development of the system. It was created to design new warheads and technical solutions that couldn't all be concentrated in one place. If Sarov was the firstborn of the atomic project, Snezhinsk became its continuation and its backup plan. Cities where materials for nuclear weapons were produced. Ozersk, Base 10, Chelyabinsk 40, Chelyabinsk 65. Ozersk grew up around the Mayak complex. This is where the first industrial reactor was launched, and the plutonium produced there went into the first Soviet atomic bomb. Ozersk was not a city of theorists. It was a city of massive industrial strain, where the atomic project became not an idea, but metal, reactors, and finished bomb material. Seversk, Tomsk 7, Berezky. Seversk was built next to the Siberian Chemical Combine, a giant production complex for highly enriched uranium and plutonium, one of the main Siberian hubs of the Soviet nuclear industry. You can see especially clearly here how a closed city turned into a living organism of its own. Residential neighborhoods, schools, and hospitals grew up beside the industrial site, but the meaning of the city was still defined by the Combine. Железногорsk, Krasnoyarsk, 26. Железнogorsk was built around the mining and chemical combine. The facility itself was placed inside a mountain massif, so it would be able to survive even a nuclear strike. It's one of the clearest examples of how the architecture of secrecy became part of military strategy. Zelenogorsk, Krasnoyarsk, 45. Zaozerny, 13. Zelenogorsk grew up next to an electrochemical plant producing weapons-grade uranium. It was a city of precise technical work and industrial discipline. Like the other atomic cities, it wasn't built as a rough, barrack-style appendage to a factory. It was built as a deliberately planned place for specialists to live. Novouralsk, Sverdlovsk, 44. Novouralsk formed around the Ural Electrochemical Combine, one of the key centers for producing highly enriched uranium. Without cities like this, it would have been impossible to sustain either the first nuclear munitions or the stability of the entire industry. Novouralsk shows that the atomic project depended not only on famous scientific centers, but also on a deep, highly technical industrial base. Cities where munitions were assembled and specialized products were made. Leznoy, Sverdlovsk, 45. Leznoy started out as the site of a plant first connected with isotope separation, and later became one of the centers for manufacturing nuclear munitions. Its history shows the classic path of a closed city especially clearly. From an emergency construction site and the first wooden houses, to a stable industrial center with developed social infrastructure. Triogorny, Zlatust 20, Zlatust 36. Triogorny was built around an instrument-making plant where nuclear munitions were produced. This was no longer a science center and not a combine producing raw material. It was the next stage, turning accumulated technologies into an actual finished product. Cities like this rarely became famous, but without them, the entire chain of the atomic project would have been incomplete. Zarechne, Penza 19. Zarechny grew up around an instrument plant where complex devices and equipment for the defense industry were made. It wasn't the main legend of the atomic project the way Sarov or Ozersk was, but it was still an important link in that large, layered system. The most important thing to understand about the history of closed cities is that they weren't just secret points on the map. They were a whole model of life. The state created them as spaces of maximum concentration, of knowledge, labor, discipline, and control. It gave people more than the country offered on average: better supply, better housing, better schools, and better medical care. But in return, people lived in a world where they couldn't freely name the city they lived in, where they couldn't just invite guests over, and where they couldn't leave whenever they wanted. The closed cities of the USSR were at the same time a showcase for the Soviet dream of order, science, and the future, and a space of extremely harsh unfreedom. Those two things existed there side by side, inseparably.